Wi-Fi doesn't reach here. It's only in the low floor, I think. Not sure, but at least my phone can't connect to the Wi-Fi.
I didn't bring any copy of the World of Ice and Fire.
We can go down. He hecho una carrera y le pilla una Z o algo.
O le pedimos a alguien por ahí que nos lo traiga, ¿no?
Sí, a alguien que
sí, a uno de los voluntarios. Tengo ahí a Lesa.
No, it's working, the Wi-Fi. Hello, good afternoon. Sorry for my horrible English, but Alejo is too shy to speak, and they come today from Sweden, so they are a bit tired to present this event. So, well, first of all, thanks to all of you for coming here instead of going to another more interesting panel, for sure. My name is Javier Marcos. I am the administrator of Los Siete Reinos, and I am surrounded by three really very amazing people. I have to say I'm really proud to be with there today. In my left, there are Elio, García and Antonsson. As you know, they are the creators of Westeros.org, the biggest web in the world about A Song of Ice and Fire. Elio was born in USA, but she moved to Sweden for love, for Linda, for that nice girl. They both studied history, so they know a lot about the history of Europe and how the history of Europe influenced George R. Martin. And on my right is Alejo Cuervo. He's the boss of Gigamés, the big boss. Without us, we wouldn't be here. I always say that without Alejo, there won't be no A Song of Ice and Fire in Spain, but there won't be also the TV show Game of Thrones. Because Alejo was the one who brought George Martin to Spain. Then from Spain, it traveled to Latin America. Then it became really popular. And when HBO decided to create the TV show Game of Thrones based on the books, he did it because he knew that the books were popular all around the world. And without Alejo, it wouldn't be possible. So if you hate the TV show, it's thanks to Alejo that it exists. And being the big boss of Gigamés.
Anyhow, I think George and his experience in all the TV production world has a lot more to do than that.
He's a very humble guy. So, but well, they are the expert about history, and he's the expert about the authors European authors that have influenced George R. Martin. Because if you ask me, what is the most popular European author that have influenced George R. Martin? And I say, well, there is Tolkien, maybe Tolkien too, but Tolkien maybe? I don't know many European authors. But we have Alejo to answer for that. So, well, the first word in the name of the topic is history. So you have to ask two fellow history experts. I don't know if they have some kind of a script, something like that. But what could you tell us about the War of the Two Roses or something like that may influence Martin?
Okay. Oh, this does actually work. Okay. The light wasn't on, so I wasn't certain. The history angle for me is quite interesting because obviously, when I first read A Game of Thrones, I was studying history at university in the United States, and I was really caught by George's use of medieval history in the work. Everyone knows the War of the Roses are a big influence, but particularly is the way he showed the culture. He showed the pageantry and the colors of sort of the chivalry, this high culture that was what medieval nobility aspired to or pretended to aspire to. It was sort of, but at the same time, George showed the reality of what knights were killing machines. The whole the court of love, the cult of chivalry was also very misogynistic in some ways, and that combination of kind of felt to me like he was moving away from how other writers, the big one, somebody like Sir Walter Scott, Ivanhoe, and all these very romanticized versions of history. George had a very different approach, which I thought was really amazing because I was a huge Tolkien fan, and Tolkien's version of how people lived and how they interacted was not really realistic. It was the epic. It was the sort of mythical, and George was bringing a kind of reality into it, which I thought was quite impressive.
For me, it's always been about this combination, I think, and it's something that I did a little talk at the book fair in Gothenburg last year, and they had arranged it so that it was me and a historian that were talking about basically how the Middle Ages are used in fiction, and also how they really relate to what the Middle Ages were actually like. Are we really seeing, is it the actual Middle Ages that we're seeing, or is it more this concept of medievalism, the image that people imagine as medieval? And one of the striking things, if you look at movies about the Middle Ages, is that you've had two distinct periods. It starts off early on with a very sort of technicolor Middle Ages. You see that in, for example, the Prince Valiant adaptation from, I think it's the 50s or 60s, one that George has a lot of admiration for and has cited several times as a great inspiration for him. That has the colors and the pageantry.
Ivanhoe. Not Prince Valiant.
Right, Ivanhoe. Yeah, you're absolutely right. And then later on, you start getting to the much sort of grittier, and people like to play up the very dirty, gritty Middle Ages, almost so much so that it becomes a sort of hyper-realism. It goes beyond even how dirty and gritty the Middle Ages actually were, and it focuses just on those dark sides. So it got to the point where you could make jokes about it, and you have Monty Python and the Holy Grail, where the knights are riding across the countryside with the king, and they come across these peasants digging in the mud, and they conclude that Arthur has to be a king. Why? Because he doesn't have any shit on him. So you're able to there draw the parody of the hyper-realistic, and George kind of plays with having both of those angles in his work, that he'll play up the pageantry and he'll make it even more colorful, even greater. He's got these fabulous, huge tournaments, and then he's got the really dark sides. And for some reason, playing with both of those images that people have with the Middle Ages creates a very interesting, it creates something of a dissonance, but it also creates an interest in these different levels of the world, I think.
Alejo, you're a bit quiet. How do you think that European history influenced George Martin?
I actually have not that much idea. The experts here in history, my own preparation was as a physicist, actually. So, go figure. Anyhow, no, I have a lot of readings in common with George. When in his what's the name of the book? The thick one with the short stories.
Dream Songs?
Dream Songs. In Dream Songs, he offers a lot of details of what were his reading when he was a young reader and everything. And there are so many common authors. He basically was the kind of science fiction and fantasy that he read at the time. It's the same authors that were popular for me as a young reader and for most of the science fiction and fantasy community all over. And referring to the inspiration for Game of Thrones, I've heard him mention some historical novelists that also had some influence on him, like Cornwell, with his, especially his Arthurian-related novels. For those that are not familiar with him, they may know, for instance, this TV show that is on available now called The Last Kingdom. I personally recommend it greatly. It's a very nice production and it gives a general feeling of the time. Also, for me as a reader, as my experience in the stuff he reads, there's one single influence that I recognize the most, and for me it's primal, and contains already several different elements that have a very strong presence in the Game of Thrones sequence. And it's Harold Foster and Prince Valiant, the comic book. The paper that has in the early side of the comic book the wall, the Adrian's Wall, all the Mediterranean exploration he does, and all the different myths and, well, mocked history Foster was so fond of offering visually to his readers. George, I think he does a bit of the same. He takes whatever he likes of different periods and mixes it all together and makes it work. But it's a playful way to use history, I can conclude somehow.
When you ask somebody about what is the most famous influence of A Song of Ice and Fire, they say, oh, the War of the Two Roses, the War of the Roses. You have York and Lancaster, and you have Stark and Lannister. And you have several kings, Richard III, that is similar to Tyrion or Stannis, or you may ask, or Margarita d'Anjou, maybe similar to Cersei. But if you look to the books, you can see a lot of influence of a lot of history. You can see that the wall is based in the Adrian Wall that built in Scotland to fight against the Picts. You can see, for example, that Hightower is really based in Alexandria, in the city of Alexandria, with the big lighthouse, the Hightower in the books, like the center of knowledge. What is for you the most surprising historical reference that George introduced in the books that isn't the typical War of the Roses reference?
Oh, that's a really good question. What I've always found is
or a funny reference that you like.
Okay, one I've always found interesting that George cites and this is not many people know about this piece of medieval history, the Albigensian Crusade, which is a crusade that took place against a heretical group, the Albigensians, in France. It was not, it was not crusaders going off to the Holy Land to fight or fighting, the Moors in Spain. It was Frenchmen fighting Frenchmen, who, because they were said to be heretics. And George decided the Albigensian Crusade as being a part of the influence for what's going on with Melisandre, and also I think to some degree of what's going on with the High Septon.
Zoroastrianism, no?
Yeah. So it's a bit of history that shows that George has kind of read a bit widely, and he's absorbed, as you say, very playfully, many aspects.
I want to add that question there. If we go beyond the novels and we enter this book here, you are personally responsible for a great deal of the book. Well, for those that are not familiar with the World of Ice and Fire book, it's fiction and non-fiction, it's meta-non-fiction. It's quite a strange book, and it's the history and atlas of the
Westeros.
Westeros and beyond, all the known world, told by a scholar inside the universe. And it's also, as I said, George is very playful whenever he puts reference inside or use material for his narrative. In this book, the kind of reference when you go in the most far away places that are spoken about in the book, you find a lot of literary reference, of classics, of Howard reference, of a lot of freaky winks. Whose are those? Yours or George's?
That is 100% George. It was George who went out of his way to work in the Lovecraftian mythos and various nods to various people.
I mean, he wants the history to be, I mean, he wants you to ground his books with the history, in a sense, and then he adds all these fantastical layers. And one interview that we did, I think it was the Stockholm one, perhaps, that when we did the panel there, where we talked to him and said that, you know, he wants there to always be mystery, that he doesn't want to explain the whole world. So even if you start off with, I think that to some extent, when you say everyone recognizes the Wars of the Roses and the, you know, the Starks, the Lannisters, and you know the Lancasters and the Yorks, I think he wanted that as his familiar starting point, much like Tolkien started off in the Shire, being sort of a familiar place, and then you go out into the wider world and things become
more difficult.
much more, you know,
complex.
Much more complex, a lot more different influences coming into it. So in a sense, I think that starting point in the very recognizable history was his way of grounding you in something that you'd recognize, and then it starts deviating more, and the more you move out from the core, the more fantastical it gets.
Well, and more playful also, yeah.
Yes.
I think it's logical because we have like the recorded written history of the war in the Citadel. So we know a lot of Westeros. We know perfectly who lives in the Reach, who lives in Winterfell. But people from Westeros doesn't know what is in GT or in Asai or who the Jogos Nai are. They don't know anything about them. So when a scholar tries to write about them, he has to imagine about something very strange and foreign, and he doesn't understand the people. So he invents, or he hears that people are really 8 feet tall or something insane like that. So it's logical. For me, the biggest signal of George R. Martin work is everything is logical, everything fits. Why this character is killed? Well, it's killed because from a narrative point of view, from a thematic point of view, he has to die. And if this character has survived his very logical death, is because he has another purpose in the history. So when you look also to The Wolf is on Fire, you can see that also that logic structure of his head. Martin is not a genius writer like Tolkien. He's a journalist. He knows how to write stories, and he knows how to do that stories logical and at the same time interesting for the reader. So all the world that he has created is also a very logical world.
I think there's something to that. I think, as Linda said, mystery is at the core of a lot of what George writes. He wrote, many years ago, he wrote a short story called With Morning Comes Mistfall, which to me, I think, says a lot about how George sees things, because this is a story set in the far future on another planet. It's a planet that's covered in mist, and there's these rumors that there's these sort of strange monsters, kind of like Loch Ness, and people come to this planet trying to find them and prove that they exist or not. And there's a fellow who runs basically a hotel there, and he says people come to this place for the mystery. They don't want to know whether they exist or not. If you reveal to them what these people really are, the mystery is gone, the magic is gone.
Like the deep ones.
Yeah, exactly. So the mystery is at a core of a lot of what George gets at, because it makes you keep yearning for it, and and it's perfect that you can never resolve it.
There's another aspect of the tone of the series that may relate to, I don't know how, George reads a lot of stuff for as documentation, and he has, for instance, I know he has explored quite Spanish medieval history also. And I wonder how much of that sets the rightful tone. There's a mastery use of ethical view of the world from all his characters. He recreates in this sense and makes more believable his novels than most of historical fiction, in the sense than the most best-selling fiction tends to recreate the same psychology as the reader expects. He doesn't want to offend him somehow. And you then realize that you find a lot of historical fiction where people behave as we will behave in modern times, with the same ethical judgment or values. George clearly doesn't do that. One of the things that shocks the most to the initial readers in the series is the cheap value of human life in Westeros. Except, of course, for nobility. But all other characters are to be expended as anything, and no character think twice about it. They are worried whenever one of their kind, one of the things they believe have rights, is in trouble. But this... Yeah. No. And this transmits, and this is, I don't know what's his skill on the one hand, or how much his documentation in historical subjects has influenced that.
Actually, that brings me to mind. One thing I know that he uses a resource that he's read is there's a very well-known, this is an American writer, but Barbara Tuchman, who wrote a history called A Distant Mirror, the Calamitous 14th Century, which is a fascinating, very readable look at a particular noble, the Seigneur de Coucy in, I think, my French is terrible, so this famous lord in France, and he had this enormous tower built, the Donjon, and it was very famous. The Nazis, I think, blew it up in World War II or World War I, I don't remember, not the Germans, sorry. Someone blew it up, I can't recall. But, and it was really interesting because Tuchman really looked at trying to give a sense of the psychology of these people, and how their worldview was so very different from ours. I mean, you have other writers, Umberto Eco and The Name of the Rose, who really digs deep into, in many ways, medieval people are like aliens in science fiction, because their grasp of how the world works is so divorced from our own. And we really, very few authors can really get that across. And George, I think, to some degree, definitely realizes that these people don't have the same values as we do. The family, the blood matters in ways that allows them to justify all sorts of things. And even in the Middle Ages, you had enormous amounts of contradiction. The Black Prince, Edward the Black Prince, held to be the greatest knight of his day, the greatest exemplar of chivalry, was a guy who wanted to, destroy entire towns because they resisted him, and people had to beg him, like, you don't have to murder everybody, you could just hang a few of them and that's enough. And yet at the same time when he's doing that, they're saying he's such an amazing, wonderful person, and it's clear that they have very, very different value judgments than what we have.
I think that there's George clearly wants to capture that. He's talked a lot about how he wanted to marry, to some extent, the not knowing, because he's talked about how he loves historical fiction, but one of the problems he has is knowing the ending. And when he writes for something for himself, he doesn't want to know precisely where the story is going, which obviously has been one of the problems that he's had in constructing the last books of A Song of Ice and Fire. But it's really important to him at the same time that he doesn't know the full path when he starts. But he wanted to take what he felt was the best of historical fiction, which a lot of it had to do with the portrayal of people as being people of their time, not people of our time. And we've seen it on many occasions where people have questioned, you have characters that do these horrible things, or you have characters that are married off when they are very young, or you have characters that go to war and
actually he makes a narrative use of as a device to subvert the text. He's playing with our moral expectations, our modern moral expectations, and then when the characters are in the logic of their times, the modern reader gets shocked.
Maybe the most beautiful prose that George has ever written is the speech of the broken men. You all know that. And that is pretty beautiful because that tries to many people still doesn't understand why there are roach people in Westeros trying to kill other people. They are criminals, they are bad people, but if you read that piece of work, you can see they have a logical behind that. That people went to a war, they lost the war, or they won the war, but they don't know because they are hundreds of miles away from their house, so they have to eat, they have to live. So they steal and they kill. And when Arya sees someone in the road, when she's with Joren and all that people, and they say, oh, there are bandits around, be careful, try to sleep all together. And you think that people are monsters, they are horrible people that try to kill Arya. But then you realize, well, if you read the books, well, that people maybe were former Stark soldiers that were lost in the way back to Winterfell. Martin really encapsulates very well the idea that every people tries to do the right thing. And in the point of view...
or either to survive.
Yes. In the point of view chapters, you can see that Cersei, in her insanity, has kind of logic, and she thinks she's doing the right thing for her children, for the realm. If you can see also a Victarion chapter, you can see that that guy is stupid, but he thinks he's also doing right things, and he rapes someone, but he thinks that someone that he raped isn't a real people, he's an slave, it's not important for him. And you say, oh, this guy is a monster, but if you enter in his head, in the head of Victarion, you realize that there is some very dark, very twisted, but a kind of logic to his behavior.
That really goes to a tenet of what George says, that every character is the hero of their own story. They all see, Hitler didn't wake up each morning and say, aha, what horrible, monstrous thing can I do that's really evil? He didn't see what he was doing as evil. He saw it as the solutions to problems and a necessity. Very few
Donald Trump doesn't wake up every morning and say, aha.
No, I suppose he doesn't.
I just have to poke fun of our American here sometimes.
Yeah. Okay, that aside, there are a few characters, what one might say, perhaps it's hard to justify how they see themselves as being good exactly. There's something like Ramsay Bolton probably does wake up wondering, what horrible thing can I do to somebody?
He thinks it's funny. He thinks, that people aren't really people.
They're not really people. He doesn't really see them. He doesn't have the same values as we do at all, and he doesn't have the same values as most people.
They're like hounds for him.
But there you have, I think, obviously a combination, I guess you can see that he's obviously has, sociopathic tendencies, pretty strong ones, not really tendencies, but combine that then with a medieval mindset, and you get somebody who feels very entitled to doing whatever he wants with people around him, and in a society where violence is a very easy solution. Violence is something that, we see that in modern society, that you have, problems of inner city violence and all these things. People get used to violence as a solution. Violence becomes something that they live with. And in the Middle Ages, people, life was, short and could often be brutal, and violence and death and warfare could, you could easily lose your home if you were a peasant. You could get your home burned and your crops ruined and everything lost due to war. So violence was very close to people, and that must have affected the mindset of people, that it was very easy for lives to become cheap.
I think that also a very interesting way of Martin of handling the past in his story is how all the point of views, even in the past, even in the Wars of Empire, have their point of view. If you read the Wars of Ice and Fire, you will read a history about the sack of King's Landing in the Rose Rebellion, that in that version, Tywin Lannister is a saint. He's a very nice people that saved the world. He didn't rape anyone. He didn't order anyone to kill anyone. I love that way of writing.
Well, but that's not medieval or historic at all. That's quite a modern narrative strategy. Yes, to present everything as you don't have an objective history at any point. Neither here. You have an atlas and a history of the world. told by the biased point of view of one of the guys there that has to be careful about what the king will say about what he's reading.
I mean, to just look at the plays that, various of Shakespeare's plays that were written to, please whoever was ruling at the time, and obviously that's going to influence how he writes about certain historical characters.
All history is safer, but modern history not so much.
Yeah.
Yes, I mean, Richard III in Shakespeare, I mean, that is the classic image of, the hunchback, the wicked, conniving man. And that's all based on, I'm blanking on the name, but a particular history that was popular at the time because it was strongly slanted against that family because that family lost.
He was very hated. I read a funny piece of news. Richard III was voted to be the most hated king of England. It was voted. I don't know, in the Guardian someone created that poll and people voted that. But then you read his history and it was a nice guy. Well, he trapped his kinays in a tower or something like that, but it wasn't the monster that. Like that. No. I am not the monster you think I am. Richard III isn't the monster that most of the people were talking about.
And speaking also of Shakespearean themes, has any Shakespeare specialist analyzed all the reference and subject matters in George novels there? Because there's a lot of classic themes and ways of going through them stories in Martin in the series also.
Certainly, there's really just the
you
other day
have the Bloody Hand in the Mercy chapter of the Will of Wicker.
That's actually
that is Shakespeare.
That is Shakespeare. That is.
Well, actually, Shakespeare is the single European influence that has arrived wider all over the world, so it's only natural.
Yeah, only natural. Just the other day, actually, I was in contact with an academic who did her PhD on Machiavellian figures. Machiavelli
is quite.
And her work was in fantasy, but she was also looking at the sort of cross section of how in fantasy many authors use Machiavelli, and how you could find elements of that within Shakespeare's work as well. So she was actually looking at Game of Thrones, Ice and Fire, actually, and Machiavelli and Shakespeare, which I thought was really interesting. Shakespeare is, of course, the most famous author in English language in the world, and it is impossible for him not to have an influence. In particular, when so much of his, I'm particularly a fan of the histories myself. The Henrys and so on, but there's a lot of Henry plays. And I know that George as well is very familiar with them, and they definitely have an impact on that. But it was funny to me because Tolkien, of course, was not particularly fond of Shakespeare.
Yeah, no, but George also is very fond of working on moral themes. The general structure and the general problem he sets involves usually a moral decision and extreme moral situation for the characters. And well, that's the basic subject of all classical literature, actually.
You have quoted Tolkien. We have only 15 minutes left.
Okay.
We have to say something about Tolkien.
We have been speaking ourselves all the time, and if we have only 15 minutes left, we at least give the opportunity to ask questions to anyone here. Anyone? There's.
Well, thank you for your very interesting talk. I have actually a couple of questions, if I may. One related to history and another one to influences. As regards history, I was thinking about the role of women in Game of Thrones and the particular influences Martin could have. Or I'm thinking about Joan of Arc, or Joan of Castile, or the Virgin Queen Elizabeth I. What do you think about that? And my second question, a little bit more related to influences. Well, I think I have to ask that question here. What about Sapkowski? Now that he's not here, I think I can ask you. Do you think, is there any kind of mutual influence between Sapkowski and George Martin with that dirty realism, dirty fantasy, the two of them write, and the moral issues that the characters have to face in both texts? Thank you.
Sure. Women, certainly Joan of Arc is Joan of Arc has something of that in her. George has drawn a lot from, I mean, in our own World of Ice and Fire, the whole conflict of A Dance of the Dragons is inspired by the conflict in England.
Dangerous woman.
Yes, between Matilda, the Empress Matilda, and King Stephen over who controlled England. And as you cited, Margaret of Anjou, various figures from sort of the War of the Roses definitely have, Elizabeth Woodville, all of these people have there are some rough analogs. I mean, as Linda said, George didn't want to write a history. He could have written a historical novel, but he didn't want to write a historical novel because he knows how it ends, and that for him, there's a little bit of, he doesn't want to know too much about his own story. He wants it to be kind of an organic thing. As to the second question, I haven't actually read Sapkowski myself. I know The Witcher through the games, and I don't know really the timeline as to sort of chronologically of when one wrote the other. But from my understanding, Sapkowski didn't really get translated to English until after the games. Is that right?
I don't really know the timing of translations of.
But certainly, I think they're exploring a lot of similar things about the complexity of being like people in the real world, but they're not living in a world where good is good and bad is bad. They're living in the world that is, and some may say, but this is a sort of for George at least. I don't know for Sapkowski, but it's sort of the post-Vietnam world. He grew up at a time when Vietnam was this huge conflict, and he was a conscientious objector. He was very sort of involved in the sort of the movement in universities and colleges against it. He was aware of what was going on, and he realized that it was a recognition that, all my life, the United States was a force for good, and I recognize that it's much more complicated than that. Sometimes it does bad things. So I definitely think there's at least some commonalities in worldviews between the authors, even if they don't necessarily have a direct influence between one another.
About powerful women in history related to Martin's work, of course, Margaret Anjou, as I said, for me is very similar to Cersei. And I have another one that for me is Anne Boleyn. For me is really similar to Margaret Tyrell, because there were women that came after a great war, and their families wanted them to be the queen of Westeros on the real world. And their families were very powerful, but they weren't the queen. They didn't have the greatest power in the land. For example, Joffrey was supposed to marry Sansa Stark. The King Edward was supposed to marry. Well, he was married to Katarina Aragon, but both families, Boleyn family, Tyrell family, move all their influence to try to make the ladies of their houses, of their families, to be the queens of the known world. And they succeeded it. We know how Anne Boleyn ended. She was beheaded, spoiler, sorry. But and we don't know the future of Margaret Tyrell. We don't know what, because Martin, in many of the influence of Martin of the War of the Roses or the post-War of the Roses, the Tudor era, he has changed always the end. The start of the story is similar to the War of the Two Roses, but the ending is always different. So I don't know what George will do with Margaret Tyrell, but I think she won't be beheaded. And about the Sapkowski question, I didn't read Sapkowski too much. I have read only like 3 or 4 of the books. And for me, they are only similar in the way that the characters, you can buy the characters. You read about the characters and you realize they are real people and they have feelings and they are imperfect and they do great stuff and bad stuff. And they are also set in a kind of medieval setting with fantasy. But their style being a bit similar for me is a bit different. Well, I am not an expert in Sapkowski.
Well, and the fantasy references are not the common to the English tradition also. Those for the readers like me that have mostly read English tradition, when you find all the reference to the different fantastic history of the East, then it gives a completely different flavor, and it's one of the Sapkowski's attractives also. also related to the presence of, in Martin, really it's quite, significant, the sheer quantity and the importance of women characters in the series. And put it like that, there's one single novel that did the trick in its day and was a great bestseller. I'm sure George has read it. That subverted the genre, all Arthurian fantasy, retelling it from the point of women. It's The Mist of Avalon by Thurman Bradley. Thurman Bradley is not speaking about much these days, but that's another subject. Anyhow, she took a traditional genre, a traditional setting for fantasy, and out of a sudden he explained the same kind of fantasy story, but retold completely from the point of a woman. I'm sure Martin was trying to equilibrate in this sense, and she is a clear reference, a clear precedent for this development.
More questions? Yes. At this Pokemon Go?
I think in another reference, classical, maybe Helena of Troy and Lyanna Stark, or yes, for the rapt of Lyanna and Helena of Troy. And another one, I see Jon Snow and Julius Caesar. Maybe you see another reference because I very interesting. We speak in our in the Tolkien Society. We speak about the influence of classic culture in the Tolkien Silmarillion, and because always think in Celtic or in, but the classic. But the classic there are in Martin too, I think.
I think that's absolutely true. George is very also familiar with Roman history. He used to roleplay about in the Roman Republic setting with some friends. I think Walter John Williams, the writer, ran the setting, and they were all very interested in that period. The classical reference that I kind of twig to, but it's not so obvious to a lot of people, it has to do with the story going forward, I think, in the novels. Although some of you who watch Game of Thrones may know where I'm going with this, is the story of Stannis Baratheon. Now, George has commented that the actor who played Tiberius in I, Claudius, the character of Tiberius, the emperor, and that actor's performance is a part of what he imagined for Stannis. But more importantly, I've long thought that Stannis' story has a lot to do with Agamemnon, and that Shireen's story has a lot to do with Iphigenia, his daughter, who was written about in, I think it was Aeschylus. It's part of the whole Odyssey, all of these sort of fan fiction around the Iliad that developed in Greek literature. In the play, I think it was one of his Iphigenia at Aulus.
Yes.
Which has to do with Agamemnon being forced by the gods, by the situation he was in, to sacrifice his daughter to achieve his ambitions. And I think that's what Stannis' story is supposed to be in The Song of Ice and Fire. And obviously Game of Thrones, obviously the showrunners believe it should be going that way as well. So there's elements of the classical world. You can see Nero and Caligula and some of the kings as well.
Talking about Lyanna, there is also a reference with the abduction of Lyanna to the death. The event that started the monarchy in Rome, that finished the monarchy in Rome and started a republic, was when the last king tried to, well, in fact, he raped a known woman in the Roman society, and there was an outrage in the streets, and finally they tried to kill or take away that horrible kings and create a republic. And that idea of there is a mad king whose younger son is infatuated with a very beautiful woman, and then the crazy king does terrible stuff, and after that they start a new regime in Rome a republic, in Westeros the Baratheon regime. For me, it's also similar. Lucretia is the girl that was raped.
And you also have the idea with that. I mean, the kings are the Etruscan kings at the time, so you have the conflict between two different people. If you're looking at the Targaryens as a separate, not a separate race, but a separate culture to some extent. And there were some distinct separations between the Etruscan and Roman culture. And then, of course, you have Robert afterwards idolizing Lyanna, and Lucretia was obviously idolized as the typical Roman, matron who had all the qualities and virtues of the Roman matron, because she killed herself after her virtue had been taken from her. So she was idolized as this perfect Roman
Her
woman.
last words are similar to Lyanna's words. She said, "You have to promise me," something like that, and they're very similar to Lyanna. More questions?
Hello. To me, and I'm ignorant in English, Dawn seems like it's based on Moorish Spain. And that's certainly how it's portrayed in the TV series. Do people who know more about Spanish history think that did influence his portrayal of Dawn and the Martells? So Andalusia, Granada.
Well, about Spanish history that has influenced Martin, there is always a word, and when people try to interview us about how Spanish medieval history influenced Martin, we always talk about Blas de Lezo. Blas de Lezo was a commander that was kind of like Tyrion in the way that he wasn't liked. He had problems with one leg, he wasn't very beautiful, and he defended the city, I think it was Cartagena de Indias, if I remember well, against a very huge army that tried to destroy them, and he saved the city, and nobody in his age tried to recognize that guy for the hero that he was. And it's the typical Spanish reference that maybe George was thinking when he wrote, of course, about the Battle of Blackwater, when Tyrion fought against the Spanish army to defend the city. And what you said, that I don't think so. I don't agree with your question about the Martells and that stuff. TV show is an alien place that we won't talk about it here. And we love Dorne, we love George Dorne, not that travesty. It's the truth. We love Dorne. We are, as a Spanish guy, I am very proud that one of the biggest influence for Dorne, maybe the most loved region of Westeros, was based in part of Spain. It also have...
It's Andalusia, and he made
you have also the
full through to document and get inspiration there.
You have the Moor stuff, you have Turkish, maybe Indian too, but the food is not Spanish, I think, too spicy for me. But yes, we have that reference, that Spanish reference in the book. As I said, I am really proud of it.
Yeah, I agree. It absolutely, it was very obvious. I mean, George has said, he mixes and matches, he blends things. So he has mentioned, for example, that it wasn't just, Dorne isn't just Moorish Spain, but he's definitely said it's definitely part of that. There's a bit of the Welsh Marchers, actually, with the border, the Dornish Marchers, that conflict, that ancient conflict between the Welsh and English. So,
and the food is from New Mexico. The spice is from New Mexico.
More questions? Or we are on time, I think.
We are right on time, actually.
Nobody. You have Elio and Linda here, come on.
You can grab us in some
it's over.
dark
Thank you all of us
corners.
for standing our horrible English and coming here. Thank you very much.
Thank you.